The rain did not fall. It was a solid thing, a liquid wall that erased the city, leaving only the blurred neon of the restaurant's sign bleeding across the asphalt. Inside, the world was amber and wood smoke. The sound was a low hum, a composite of hushed conversations. The distant clink of silver on porcelain, and the almost imperceptible sigh of the ventilation system. It was a soundscape of immense, curated calm, a fortress against the chaos of the storm and the street. At the entrance, standing behind a lectern of dark, polished oak that felt as old and solid as a church pew, was Alara. She was not a hostess. She was a ghost inhabiting the role. Her uniform, a simple black dress, severe and unadorned, was a kind of camouflage, allowing her to dissolve into the shadows between the warm pools of light cast by the shaded lamps. She moved with an economy of motion that was unnatural in a place of such studied leisure. When she picked up a reservation book, her fingers did not fumble. They located the page with quiet precision. When she smiled at arriving guests, the expression did not quite reach her eyes. Her eyes were observers, analysts, cataloging the fall of a coat, the tension in a hand, the subtle shift of weight that betrayed impatience or anxiety. They were the eyes of her father, a man who had navigated the treacherous currents of international diplomacy, a man who had taught her that the most important conversations were silent ones. He had taught her that stillness was a weapon, and that true power never needed to raise its voice. Now his lessons were reduced to this: seating patrons in a restaurant that smelled of old money and roasted duck. It was a form of penance, a self-imposed exile from a world that had broken him, and by extension, her. An elderly couple, the Abernathys, stood before her, their faces etched with the gentle patience of a long life lived together. Mr. Abernathy held his wife's elbow, his knuckles a constellation of pale bumps on his thin, spotted hand. They had been waiting for 20 minutes. A reservation mishap, a table that remained occupied by lingering diners. Alara had offered them complimentary champagne, which they had politely refused. They were content to wait, standing just inside the door, their presence a small, quiet island of dignity. Alara's attention was a finely tuned instrument, and it registered the change before it was visible. It was a subtle pressure shift in the room's atmosphere, the psychic equivalent of a barometer falling. The low hum of conversation faltered for a half-second. A waiter, mid-stride, slowed his pace, his instincts telling him something was amiss. Then came the sound, muted by the rain and the thick glass of the door. The low, guttural growl of powerful engines, not one but several, idling in unison. It was a sound that did not belong in this discreet corner of the city. It was the sound of a predator announcing its arrival. Headlights sliced through the watery darkness, sweeping across the front windows in a synchronized ballet of cold, white light. 3 black sedans, identical and immaculate, had pulled up to the curb, their metallic hides shedding water like the backs of leviathans. They took up the entire street, a blockade of silent, menacing intent. The doors of the lead car opened. 2 men emerged, moving with a fluid, predatory grace, their dark suits impervious to the downpour. They did not run. They simply moved through the rain as if it were an inconvenience beneath their notice. One opened a large black umbrella, holding it over the rear passenger door. The other scanned the street, his eyes missing nothing, his posture a study in coiled tension. The man who stepped out of the back seat was not large, but he seemed to absorb the light around him. He moved with a stillness that was more imposing than any physical bulk. His suit was a shade of charcoal so dark it was almost black, tailored to perfection. He did not look at the rain, or the street, or the building. His gaze was fixed forward, as if he were already inside, already at his destination. This was Mr. Sterling. Alara did not know his name, but she knew his archetype. She had seen men like him in embassies and state dinners, men whose quiet presence could silence a room, whose power was so absolute it required no performance. They were the architects of the world, moving pieces on a board she was no longer even allowed to see. The two men flanked him, one slightly ahead, who pulled open the heavy oak door of the restaurant. A gust of cold, rain-scented air swirled into the foyer, carrying with it the smell of wet wool and ozone. It was an invasion of the carefully constructed piece. The lead man, broad-shouldered and with a face like a clenched fist, stepped inside. His eyes swept the room, dismissing the decor, the other patrons, the staff. They were obstacles. Furniture. His gaze landed on Alara, and his mouth tightened into a smirk. He saw a uniform, a service worker, a non-entity. He saw the lectern as a flimsy barrier to be pushed aside. He walked toward her, his wet leather shoes squeaking softly on the polished floor. The sound was an obscenity in the quiet room. He did not acknowledge the Abernethys, forcing the old man to take a half-step back to avoid a collision. The gesture was small, but it was a declaration. We are here. The world rearranges itself for us. Marco, for that was his name, though she would not learn it for some time, stopped directly in front of the lectern. He leaned in, planting his hands on the polished wood, his proximity an act of intimidation. "The restaurant requires a reservation, sir." Her voice was low, calm, and utterly devoid of fear or deference. It was a simple statement of fact. Marco's smirk widened. He glanced back at the door, where Mr. Sterling was now stepping inside, shaking the last of the rain from his coat. "He's here. A table. The best one." It was not a request. It was an announcement of an accomplished fact. "I'm afraid we are fully committed this evening." Again, her voice was a flat line of professional courtesy. Her heart rate had not increased by a single beat. This was a familiar scenario, a negotiation of power. She had watched her father face down warlords and despots with less bluster than this man. The man, Marco, chuckled, a low, guttural sound. He looked past her, his eyes scanning the dining room. "You don't understand. That's Mr. Sterling. You'll find a table." He straightened up, his posture broadcasting a mixture of threat and condescension. He was a guard dog, proud of his master, eager to show his teeth. Mr. Sterling stood just inside the door, silent, his gaze unreadable. He was watching the exchange, his face a mask of detached curiosity. He was not impatient. He was observing. He was assessing. Alara's gaze did not waver from the first man. She gave a single, almost imperceptible nod of acknowledgement. "I understand perfectly. However, without a reservation, I cannot seat you." Her eyes flicked for a moment to the Abernethys, who were now pressed against the wall, trying to make themselves invisible. Their quiet dignity was being eroded by this man's arrogance. It was a small, casual act of cruelty, the kind the world was built on. And it was the kind she could no longer tolerate. A new policy had been instituted 2 weeks prior, a desperate measure by the owner to combat a string of high-end dine-and-dasher incidents. For parties of 6 or more without a reservation, a deposit was required. A prepayment for a private room held on a credit card before service. It was a clumsy, insulting rule, born of fear and financial strain. It was a rule no one ever expected to have to enforce on a man like Mr. Sterling. But it was a rule. And for Alara, in her self-imposed exile, the rules were all she had left. They were the girders of a collapsed life. She slid a small, leather-bound menu across the lectern. It contained the details for the private dining rooms. "For a party of your size, we have 1 room available. It requires prepayment." Her words were quiet, but they landed in the tense silence of the foyer with the force of a gavel. The air thickened. The man, Marco, stared at her as if she had just spoken in a dead language. His face, which had been a mask of arrogant certainty, now registered a flicker of genuine disbelief. It was a look she had seen before, on the faces of men who had never been told no. He blinked slowly, processing the information. He looked from her placid face to the menu. then back again. Prepayment. The words came out as a strangled whisper, a puff of incredulous air. He turned his head to look at Mr. Sterling, a silent appeal for his master to witness this absurdity, this breach of the natural order. Mr. Sterling's expression had not changed. His dark eyes were fixed on Alara, and for the first time she felt the full weight of his attention. It was not menacing. It was analytical. It was the gaze of a master craftsman examining a strange and unexpected piece of work. He was not looking at a hostess. He was looking at an anomaly. The second man, quieter and leaner than Marco, shifted his weight. It was a small, almost invisible movement, but it was a signal of rising tension. The foyer had become a stage, and the entire restaurant was the audience. Conversations had died away completely. The only sound was the drumming of the rain against the glass and the soft, insistent squeak of Marco's shoe as he shifted his weight back onto his front foot, leaning over the lectern once more. "You think you can ask Mr. Sterling to pay first?" His voice was low now, a gravelly threat. He was no longer performing for the room. This was personal. She had insulted his boss, and by extension, she had insulted him. He placed a hand on the reservations book, his thick fingers splayed across the page. A gesture of ownership. He was taking control of her space. It is the restaurant's policy. She did not raise her voice. She did not lean back. Her posture remained unchanged, a column of quiet defiance. She met his gaze directly. Her father's voice echoed in her memory, a lesson from a sun-drenched balcony in a forgotten country. Never let them see you react. Your stillness is your shield. Let their anger break against it like waves on a rock. She could feel the heat radiating from him, the animal aggression coiled in his shoulders. He laughed, a short, sharp bark that held no humor. Policy. He pushed the heavy reservation book, sending it sliding across the polished oak toward her. It stopped just short of the edge. He was testing her, pushing the boundary. He wanted a reaction. Fear, anger, submission. Any would do. Alara simply placed her hand on the book, her fingers resting lightly on the cool leather, and gently slid it back to its original position. The movement was calm, deliberate, and final. It was not a retreat. It was a re-establishment of order. This small act of defiance seemed to break something in him. The thin veneer of civility shattered. His face darkened, the blood rising to his cheeks. Enough of this. He reached across the lectern, his hand shooting out to grab her arm. His intention was clear: to physically move her, to discard her like an inconvenient piece of furniture and clear the way for his master. It was the classic application of brute force, the final argument of a man with no other recourse. But his fingers never closed around her arm. Alara moved, but it was not a retreat. It was a subtle, almost imperceptible shift of her body. As his hand came toward her, she pivoted slightly at the waist, her left hand coming up, not to block, but to guide. Her fingers, delicate but firm, made contact with the inside of his wrist, pressing on the radial nerve with practiced surgical precision. Her thumb found a pressure point at the base of his own thumb. It was not a strike. It was a connection, a redirection of energy. A jolt, like a low-voltage electric shock, shot up Marco's arm. His fingers, which had been reaching to grasp, went numb and splayed open involuntarily. His forward momentum, meant to intimidate and overpower, was suddenly his enemy. With the same fluid motion, Alara used his own weight against him, turning his lunge into an awkward stumble. He lurched sideways, his balance gone, catching himself on the edge of the lectern to keep from falling. The entire sequence took less than 2 seconds. It was executed without a single wasted motion, without aggression, without any visible sign of effort. It was the physical equivalent of her calm, quiet voice. It was not an attack. It was a correction. A firm, undeniable statement that this boundary would not be crossed. Marco stared at his own hand, flexing his fingers, a look of profound confusion on his face. He felt no pain, only a lingering tingling and the deep, humiliating shock of being so effortlessly neutralized. He had been a bull charging a matador, and the matador had simply stepped aside, leaving him to blunder past into empty air. The foyer was utterly silent. The only sound was Marco's ragged breathing. He looked up at Alara, his eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and dawning primal fear. He was seeing her for the first time, not as a hostess, but as something else, something he did not understand and could not intimidate. From the doorway, a voice finally spoke. It was quiet, but it cut through the tension like a shard of ice. Marco. The word was not loud, but it carried the absolute weight of command. Mr. Sterling had not moved. His hands were clasped behind his back, his posture relaxed. But his eyes were now fixed on his subordinate, and they were cold. Cold with the disappointment of a king witnessing a clumsy and embarrassing failure by one of his knights. Marco flinched as if struck. He straightened up immediately, his face draining of color. The arrogance was gone, replaced by the naked fear of a subordinate who has failed his master publicly. Yes, Mr. Sterling. The words were a choked whisper. Mr. Sterling's gaze shifted from Marco back to Alara. He took 2 slow steps forward, his immaculate shoes making no sound on the floor. He stopped on the other side of the lectern, his presence creating a new and far more potent center of gravity in the room. He looked at her, and his eyes held a flicker of something she could not quite decipher. It was not anger. It was appraisal, recognition. He had witnessed the entire exchange, not just the physical move, but the unwavering calm that preceded it. He had seen the rock, and he had seen the wave break. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. It was not an apology, but it was an acknowledgement. He then looked at the menu she had indicated earlier, the one detailing the terms for the private room. He read it for a moment, his expression unreadable. Alara did not speak. She waited. The power had shifted, not from him to her, but from the loud, brutish performance of power to the quiet, authentic reality of it. After a long moment, he looked up from the menu and met her eyes again. The room is acceptable. He reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and produced a wallet made of black, supple leather. He did not extract a credit card. Instead, he pulled out a single, solid piece of metal. It was not a card. It was a coin, heavy and dark, made of a burnished, unfamiliar alloy. On its surface was a complex, stylized engraving of a lion's head. He placed it on the lectern, sliding it across the polished wood to her. The coin made a soft, heavy sound as it came to rest in front of her. Keep this, for the inconvenience. He said it not as a tip, but as a transaction of a different kind. It felt less like payment and more like a marker, a sign of a debt acknowledged. His voice was a low, smooth baritone, the voice of a man accustomed to being obeyed without question, yet there was no threat in it now. Only a quiet finality. He then turned his gaze to the Abernathys, who were still standing by the wall, watching with wide, fearful eyes. For the first time, a hint of something other than cold authority entered his expression. A shadow of something. Regret? Perhaps. He looked at the elderly couple, at their frightened faces, and then back at Alara. His man had been clumsy. He had been disrespectful not just to her, but to the innocent. It was a breach of a code, a stain on his own discipline. Mr. Sterling looked back at Marco, who was standing ramrod straight, his face pale and slick with sweat. Apologize to them. The command was soft-spoken, almost a murmur, but it carried the force of a physical blow. Marco's head snapped up, his eyes wide with disbelief. He apologize? To them? To these nobodies? It was a humiliation far greater than being physically handled. It was a stripping of his status, a public rebuke. Mr. Sterling did not raise his voice. He simply waited, his gaze unwavering. Marco's throat worked. He swallowed hard, his bravado utterly shattered. He turned his head slowly, reluctantly, toward the Abernathys. The words were forced out of him, a painful rasp. I apologize for my rudeness. He could not bring himself to look them in the eye. He stared at a point on the wall just above Mr. Abernathy's head. Mr. Abernathy, a man of quiet courage, simply nodded once, a gesture of grace in the face of such uncouth power. He pulled his wife a little closer. There was no victory in his eyes, only a weary sadness. Mr. Sterling then turned his attention back to Alara. "We will take the room." He gestured to the quiet, leaner man who had remained by the door. This man stepped forward, produced a sleek, black credit card, and handed it to Alara without a word. His movements were efficient and professional, a stark contrast to Marco's blustering. Alara took the card. Her movements were as precise and unhurried as they had been all evening. She processed the prepayment, her fingers moving deftly over the keypad of the terminal. The machine chirped its approval. She handed the card back with a receipt. "Your room is ready, if you'll follow me." She stepped out from behind the lectern. For the first time, the men saw that she was not tall, but she carried herself with a straight-spined posture that gave her an illusion of height. She did not look at Marco, who now seemed to have shrunk, his massive shoulders slumped in defeat. She led the way, not toward the main dining room, but down a quiet, carpeted hallway toward the private suites. Mr. Sterling followed, his 2 men falling into step behind him. As they walked away, the low hum of conversation slowly began to return to the dining room, but it was different now. It was laced with whispers, with the nervous energy of a flock of birds that has just narrowly avoided a hawk. Before she turned the corner, Alara glanced back at the foyer. The Abernathys were still there. She caught Mr. Abernathy's eye and gave him a small, reassuring nod. She then walked to the now vacant prime table by the window, a table that had just been cleared. She picked up the small brass reserved sign and placed it firmly in the center of the white linen. She would seat the elderly couple there herself as soon as she was done. It was a small gesture, but it was an act of restoring balance, of reaffirming that decency, in this small corner of the world, still had a place. Her father had lost his war against the world's casual cruelty, but tonight, in this small, insignificant skirmish, she had held the line. As she led the silent, powerful man down the hall, she felt the weight of the strange coin in her pocket. It was heavy, like a promise, or a threat. She was not sure which. The private dining room was at the far end of the corridor, a space soundproofed by heavy wood and thick carpets. The air inside was still and smelled of beeswax and old leather. A single, long mahogany table dominated the room, set for 10 with gleaming silver and crystal. A low fire crackled in a stone hearth at one end. Alara gestured to the table. "The lighting is adjustable here, sir. Your server will be with you momentarily to take your drink orders." She maintained the perfect facade of professional detachment, her voice a soothing, neutral tone. Mr. Sterling walked past her into the room, his gaze sweeping over the details. He did not look at the fire or the expensive art on the walls. He seemed to be listening to the room's silence, measuring its quality. He walked to the head of the table, but did not sit. He turned to face her, his 2 men taking up positions near the door, silent as statues. Marco remained in the hallway, pointedly excluded. "What is your name?" Mr. Sterling's voice was different in the enclosed space, quieter, more personal. "Ilara." She answered without hesitation. She did not offer a last name. "Ilara." He repeated it softly, as if testing the weight of the word on his tongue. He looked at her hands, which were clasped loosely in front of her. They were steady. He looked at her eyes. They were clear and direct. They held no fear. "Where did you learn that?" She knew he was not asking about her hostess training. The question was precise. It referred to the 2 seconds in the foyer, the moment the physical boundary was tested and held. A brief, flickering image of her father came to her. A memory of a training room in a secure compound, the smell of sweat and disinfectant mats. He had been showing her how to use an opponent's momentum, not as a fighter, but as a survivor. The goal is not to win, he had said, his voice gentle but firm. The goal is to de-escalate, to create space, to show that you are not a target. My father. He believed a person should know how to maintain their own space. The answer was truthful, yet vague. It gave nothing away. Mr. Sterling nodded slowly, a thoughtful expression on his face. Your father was a wise man. He paused, his gaze intense, analytical. He's a fool. He said the words quietly, and it took Alara a moment to realize he was referring to Marco, who was still stewing in his humiliation out in the hall. Power is not a hammer, Alara. It is a scalpel. You use it with precision, or you cause unnecessary damage. He has much to learn. The statement hung in the air between them. It was a glimpse into his philosophy, a shard of his personal code. He was not just a brute, he was a strategist. And he was deeply displeased with the clumsy tactics of his subordinate. He saw the incident not as an insult to his authority, but as a failure of discipline within his own ranks. He gestured to the chair at the opposite end of the long table. Please, sit. It was not a request. Alara hesitated for only a fraction of a second. A hostess does not sit with the guests. But he was no longer treating her as a hostess. The script had been discarded. She walked the length of the table, the thick carpet swallowing the sound of her footsteps, and sat. The chair was heavy, upholstered in dark green leather. She sat with her back straight, her hands resting in her lap. The vast expanse of polished mahogany between them felt like a negotiating table in one of those embassies from her past. The man in the suit is not me. He is my employee. His behavior reflected poorly on my judgment in hiring him. Do you understand the distinction? He was clarifying a point of honor. He was separating himself from the crude actions of his underling. I understand that he works for you. Her reply was simple, non-committal. It offered no absolution. He appreciated that. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched the corners of his mouth. It vanished as quickly as it appeared. You are not from here. Your accent is clean, polished. Mid-Atlantic, perhaps. Boarding school. He was reading her history from the sound of her vowels. I've lived many places. Again, the truth, but a curated version of it. He leaned forward slightly, his hands resting on the table. He did not look at her as an employer looks at an employee. He looked at her as an equal, as a fellow player in a game she did not yet realize she was a part of. People who have lived many places, people with your skills, do not typically work as hostesses in restaurants, not unless they are hiding, or waiting for something. Which is it? The question was direct, a surgical probe into her life. Her first instinct was to deflect, to retreat behind the bland wall of professional courtesy. But she knew that would not work with this man. He dealt in truth, however brutal. To lie would be a sign of weakness. To evade would be an insult to his intelligence. She met his gaze across the table. A little of both. The honesty of the admission seemed to surprise him. He settled back in his chair, studying her with renewed interest. He was a collector of rare things, and he had just stumbled upon a specimen he did not recognize. The server, a young man named David with perpetually nervous eyes, chose that moment to enter. He stopped dead just inside the door, seeing Alara seated at the table with the intimidating guest. His face was a mask of confusion. He held a silver tray with a bottle of water and 2 glasses. Mr. Sterling did not turn to look at him. Leave it. The command was soft, but David flinched and immediately placed the tray on a nearby sideboard before backing out of the room as if escaping a predator's den. Mr. Sterling picked up the conversation as if there had been no interruption. Hiding is a temporary solution. Waiting is a strategy. A person with your composure, your discipline. You are wasted here. It was not a compliment. It was a statement of fact, an observation on the inefficient allocation of a valuable resource. This is where I choose to be. Her voice was firm. It was a declaration of agency. This humble, quiet life was a choice. Her choice. He nodded, accepting this, but he did not believe it was a permanent choice. Choice is a luxury, Alara. Circumstance often has the final vote. He let the words settle in the quiet room. He was planting a seed. He was opening a door she had long ago bolted shut. He stood up, the silent signal that the audience was over. Thank you for your professionalism, and for the lesson you provided my associate. He walked toward the door. The quieter of his two men opened it for him. As he was about to step into the hallway, he paused and looked back at her. The coin I gave you, it is not currency. It is a contact. On the reverse side, there is a number. If your circumstances should change, and you find yourself in need of a more suitable application for your talents, you will call that number. They will know who sent you. And with that, he was gone. The door clicked shut, leaving her alone in the silent, opulent room. The air still vibrated with the intensity of his presence. She sat there for a long moment, the silence pressing in on her. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the coin. It was heavier than it looked, cool and solid in her palm. She turned it over. Etched into the dark metal on the reverse side, in tiny, precise numerals, was a phone number with a foreign country code. She closed her hand around it, the raised edges of the lion's head pressing into her skin. A contact. A door into a world she had fought so hard to escape. A world of power and shadows, of men who moved pieces on a global board. A world that had destroyed her father. She felt a chill crawl up her spine that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. She had stood her ground, and in doing so, she had caught the eye of a king. She had wanted to remain invisible, but instead, she had been seen. Truly seen, for the first time in years, and she was terrified by what that might mean. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of forced normalcy. Alara returned to her post, her face an impassive mask. She seated the Abernathys at the prime table by the window, apologizing for their wait. Mr. Abernathy patted her hand, his eyes full of a gentle, paternal concern. "Be careful, my dear," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "The world has sharp edges." She simply nodded, the heavy coin a cold weight in her pocket. The party in the private room was quiet. There was no loud talking, no boisterous laughter. Orders were placed, food was delivered, and the door remained closed. The server, David, returned from each visit to the room looking paler than the last, his hands trembling slightly. He reported that they spoke little, and that the man named Marco sat at the far end of the table, his head bowed, not touching his food. He was a dog in the master's kennel, banished to the corner in disgrace. At 11 o'clock the party departed. They left as they arrived, a silent, efficient procession. "Mr." Sterling paused at the lectern as he was leaving. He did not say a word. He simply met Alara's eyes and gave another one of his small, almost imperceptible nods. It was a gesture of finality, a seal on the night's events. Then he was gone, swallowed by the rain and the night, his convoy of black sedans pulling away from the curb and disappearing into the city's glittering darkness. When the restaurant was finally empty, the owner, a perpetually flustered man named Mr. Dubois, came rushing out of his office. He had been hiding there all evening, terrified of the powerful men in his private room. He looked at the final bill, his eyes widening at the size of the tip Mr. Sterling's associate had left. It was an obscene amount, enough to cover the restaurant's payroll for a week. He looked at Alara, his expression a mixture of awe and terror. "What did you do?" he asked, his voice trembling. "I followed your policy, Mr. Dubois," she replied, her voice flat. "That's all." He stared at her, unable to comprehend how enforcing a clumsy rule about prepayment could result in such an outcome. He saw her as he always had, a quiet, efficient, but ultimately unremarkable employee. He could not see the steel beneath the surface. He could not see the diplomat's daughter. the survivor of a world he could not even imagine. Alara went home to her small, sparse apartment. It was a place of monastic simplicity, with few possessions and fewer memories. It was a space designed for invisibility, a place to forget. But tonight, the silence of the apartment felt different. It felt charged, expectant. She took the coin from her pocket and placed it on her small kitchen table. It lay there under the cold light of a single overhead bulb, the engraved lion's head seeming to watch her with ancient, knowing eyes. For years she had lived by a single, guiding principle: to be unnoticed, to be a ghost. She had cultivated a life of such profound quiet that she had almost ceased to exist. It was a fortress she had built to protect herself from the pain of her past, from the memory of her father's ruin. He had been a man of principle, a man who believed in order and negotiation. He had tried to build bridges in a world that preferred to build walls. And for his efforts, he had been betrayed. Not by his enemies, but by the very people he had served. They had cut him loose, sacrificed him for political expediency, leaving him a broken man, his name and reputation destroyed. She had watched the light go out of his eyes, and she had vowed never to make the same mistake. She would never trust a system. She would never make herself visible enough to become a target. But tonight, that fortress had been breached. Mr. Sterling had seen through her camouflage. He had not seen a hostess. He had seen a kindred spirit, a person of discipline and quiet strength. He had seen an asset. His offer was not a job. It was a temptation. A path back into the world of consequence. A world where her skills would matter. A world where she could be more than a ghost. She picked up the coin, its weight familiar now. She thought of the Abernathys, of their quiet dignity in the face of Marco's casual cruelty. She had stood up for them, not out of bravery, but out of a deep, instinctual rejection of that kind of injustice. It was her father's legacy, a moral compass so deeply ingrained in her that even in her exile, she could not ignore its pull. Was this her chance? Not for revenge, she had long ago purged that poison from her soul, but for something else, for restitution, for the opportunity to use her father's lessons not to hide, but to build. Mr. Sterling was not a good man. She knew that. He was a predator, a king in a kingdom of shadows. But he had a code. He understood honor. He had punished his own man for a breach of discipline. In his own dark way, he was a man of order, just as her father had been. Perhaps, she thought, this was the new shape of the world. Perhaps the old institutions of diplomacy and law were just hollow shells, and the real power, the real order, was held by men like him. She spent the next week in a state of quiet turmoil. Every day she went to the restaurant, stood at her lectern, and performed her role with flawless precision. But something had shifted. The world seemed sharper, the colors more vivid. She was aware of the subtle currents of power in every interaction, the silent negotiations for status and dominance that played out over dinner reservations and table requests. She saw the fear in Mr. Dubois' eyes every time he looked at her, the new, cautious respect from the other staff. She had become a legend in the restaurant's small ecosystem, the hostess who had faced down the mob and won. They didn't understand what had really happened. It wasn't a victory. It was a recruitment. The coin sat on her table at home, a silent, potent question. To call the number would be to step off a cliff. It would be to abandon the safety of her invisibility and enter a world from which there was likely no return. To not call would be to condemn herself to a life of being a ghost, a spectator forever haunted by the memory of her father's defeat and her own quiet diminishment. 1 week after the incident, a package arrived for her at the restaurant. It was a long, flat box, wrapped in simple brown paper with no return address. Her name was written on it in clean block letters. She took it to the break room, her heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm. With steady hands she opened it. Inside, nestled on a bed of black silk, was a single, perfect white orchid, its roots bound in moss. There was no card. There was no note. But she knew, with absolute certainty, who had sent it. The orchid was her father's favorite flower. He had grown them in a small, humid greenhouse attached to their home in every country they had ever lived in. It was a detail no one could have known. No one except someone with the resources to delve into the deepest, most sealed records of a disgraced diplomat's life. Mr. Sterling had not just been assessing her in that room. He had been researching her. He had been vetting her. The orchid was a message. It said, "I know who you are. I know where you come from. I know what you have lost." It was an act of profound, invasive intimacy. It was a demonstration of his reach, of his power. But it was also something else. It was a gesture of understanding. He was not just offering her a job. He was offering her a chance to reclaim a part of herself she thought was gone forever. That night, she went home and stood before the small table in her kitchen. The coin and the orchid sat side by side, a study in contrasts. The hard, dark metal of his world, and the fragile, living beauty of her father's. She looked at the phone number on the coin. It was a choice between two kinds of silence: the silence of the grave she had dug for herself, or the quiet, watchful silence of the predator. Her father had been a good man, and the world had broken him. She was his daughter. She had his discipline, his perception, but she did not have his faith in the systems that had betrayed him. Perhaps, she thought, you could not fix a broken world by being good. Perhaps you could only force it into a better shape by being strong. She picked up her phone. Her fingers were steady as she dialed the long international number. It rang twice, a strange purring tone from a distant continent. A voice answered, a woman's voice, crisp and professional. The accent was Swiss German. Yes? Alara took a breath. She did not say her name. She did not need to. She simply spoke the words she knew they were waiting for. I was told to call. I have a coin with a lion's head. There was a pause on the other end of the line, the sound of a key being tapped on a computer. Then the voice returned, warmer now. We have been expecting you. Mr. Sterling is pleased you have decided to accept his offer. A car will be waiting for you at your address in 1 hour. Please bring only what is essential. Your other affairs will be managed. The line went dead. Alara lowered the phone. 1 hour. Her life, the quiet, gray existence she had so carefully constructed, was about to be dismantled. She looked around her small, bare apartment. There was nothing here she needed to take. Her only essential possession was the legacy her father had left her, a set of skills and a moral code that had, against all odds, survived. She walked to her closet and took out a simple, well-made travel bag. She packed a few changes of clothes, all of them in shades of black and gray. She was a ghost, after all. She was just changing her haunting grounds. As she was about to close the bag, she paused. She went back to the kitchen and carefully picked up the white orchid. She found a small box and packed it gently, cushioning it with tissue paper. She would not leave her father's memory behind. She would carry it with her, into the heart of the shadows. Exactly 1 hour later, a black sedan, identical to the ones in Mr. Sterling's Convoy, pulled up to the curb outside her building. It sat there, engine idling, a silent, waiting promise. She took one last look at the apartment that had been her sanctuary and her prison. Then she picked up her bag, walked out the door, and did not look back. The rain had stopped. The night was clear, and the city lights glittered like a web of fallen stars. She was stepping into that web, not as prey, but as a new and patient spider. The hostess was gone. Alara was about to begin. The car door opened for her, a silent invitation into her new life, a world not of menus and reservations, but of scalpels and kings.